Welcome everyone to the ISM Rochester webinar program. I'm so excited we're able to bring this particular topic to the chapter. I'm very, very excited about circular supply chain, and Ian's a fantastic speaker. So I'm so glad that we're able to bring this topic to all of our members. We do want to hear from you, so please make sure you use the chat and the Q&A function for any questions you may have for our speaker today. So let's get started with our program. Our speaker for today is Ian Boyd. He is the Associate Director within Corcentric's Source to Pay Consulting Group, contributing to large-scale sourcing engagements focused on delivering results in the MRO and facility management spend categories. Ian leads Corcentric's MRO and facility sourcing practice, managing a team of subject matter experts that typically operates as an extension of a sourcing team to deliver cost savings and operational improvements. He has 9 years of experience in strategic sourcing with expertise in the chemical, steel, packaging, and pharmaceutical industries, where he has negotiated agreements for direct materials, MRO supplies, contract manufacturing, and facility management services. He holds a Bachelor of Science degrees in both chemistry and economics from the University of Pittsburgh and is a featured writer at strategicsourcer.com. Ian, the stage is yours.
All right, thanks, Kathy. Appreciate the introduction. And thank you everyone for joining. So I'm gonna set my screen up. I do have a presentation to share. I wanna make sure you're all seeing what you need to see. So let me start presenting now. And Kathy, maybe you can confirm, are you seeing the correct screen, not the presentation mode?
No, I don't see a screen yet. It's not sharing yet.
Let's see.
Now we're sharing.
All right. And how about now? You're seeing the correct one?
Yep, perfect.
All right, perfect. So perfect. Again, thanks everyone for joining. Kathy really gave a great intro. Just to highlight one particular point, I really came up in the chemical industry, which, as you can imagine, is the concept of sustainability and environmental responsibility is an important one in that industry. The impact can be pretty substantial in the negative or positive. So, there were programs, and I'll talk about some examples once we get into this, that are kind of close to my heart, for lack of a better term, and programs that we put in place that specifically address this in a industry that is that really needs it, that it's really important. And so I just want to highlight that to give a little credence about why I'm here, why I'm talking about this concept, and why sustainability matters in my work and my career. So the concept here, or what we want to talk about, is circular supply chains, but how that fits under the umbrella of sustainability, and how that fits into procurement strategies for reducing costs and risk. So I always like to start by setting the stage about why we need to address sustainability, why that matters. So sustainability as a concept, why do we need to do this? And the most obvious immediate answer would be this idea of environmental responsibility. So that can operate on both a micro and macro level. So at a micro level, let's say you have a plant, thinking about how can we reduce pollution and waste directly coming out of our plants or our production facilities, the stuff that we can see going into the water or the air, but also considering on a macro level, as companies, what's our piece in the puzzle of addressing climate change and kind of being good citizens of the world at a more broad level. So kind of moving on to something a little more tactical, sustainability can also address customer demands. So there's this overarching question of, does sustainability drive demand and growth, or can it drive demand and growth? Will customers pay more for a more sustainable product, or can we even increase our margins or charge a premium for a more sustainable product? So at least in this, if you see a product on the shelf and it looks like the green solution or the more sustainable solution, are you willing to pay an upcharge, or are you more driven towards that purchase because it was produced in a more environmentally responsible way? And still in the concept of increasing margins, yes, you can maybe drive price in certain cases. On the flip side, sustainable solutions in production and supply chain, those can be cost-saving initiatives as well. And I'll really hammer that point home more later. But we can also take cost out by implementing recycle programs, reintroducing certain raw materials that would have been more expensive if we were buying a virgin product, for example. And so there's really two ways that you can push or increase margins, both in a price and cost level. And then, this overarching theme of consumer preference, we still see a gap in purchase patterns. So about 60% of consumers will say they want sustainability, but when you actually get to the point of sale, only about 5 or 10% are actually going to pick the more sustainable option if it's a higher cost. Anecdotally, do we think that trend may rise over time? A little hard to say, right? But it's just something to keep in mind that there is a subset of the population that will pay more for that sustainable product, and that can feed into a marketing strategy while simultaneously fitting into this idea of good corporate citizenship. This next point, very much a supply chain type of topic, resource scarcity. So this is particularly for scarce products. Can we decrease our reliance on single and sole sources and in effect increase the supply through recycle and reuse programs? So that can address both price and risk, right? So if we find ways to increase our supply by instituting recycle programs, you're probably going to pay a cheaper price for that recycled product. You've increased your supply base, that drives price down, and simultaneously you're less reliant on a product that may be coming out of a single location or a single producer. Situational, but there is an opportunity to address resource scarcity and single and sole sources through sustainability efforts. And then lastly, just regulatory trends. The government is coming forward and stating that we need to, reduce carbon footprint and implement carbon capture, whatever that may look like. Sustainability and the tactics that we'll talk about are ways that can address some of those regulatory programs or trends that may be changing over time. And we can get out ahead of those things and be ahead of the curve while still doing it in a way that is business positive. So that's kind of the overarching theme of just sustainability and why we're talking about this. So the next step would be, well, let's talk tactically about how can we implement sustainable practices within our organizations. And that's where we get to this idea of defining the circular economy. And so this is one of those slides where I just read it verbatim because it's, we are defining this. So creating circular economies, it's an exercise in rethinking our supply chains, how we structure our economies to minimize waste and incorporate sustainable practices. Pretty self-explanatory. But the second piece is really the important part and feeds into what we'll talk about next. This includes rethinking both our inputs and outputs or waste streams, incorporating newer recycled materials, cleaner technologies, and new organizational and logistical practices. And the key point there being, we need to think beyond raw material inputs. Sustainability and this is a culture. This is a practice that permeates into materials. It permeates into technologies and logistics and organizational behaviors. And so we'll dig into this, but when we think about the circular economy, we need to think broadly about organizational wide behavior and how we can implement that into to driving towards these sustainable solutions. If anyone, I'm going to lose half the audience on this one, but if anyone here has taken biology courses in high school or college, if you think about like the photosynthesis or the Krebs cycle back in those days, you can think of those diagrams that were literal circles. You had inputs and outputs and proteins that were coming in and being converted, but you were it was a closed loop system for the most part. And so what we're trying to do is make our internal processes almost mimic those biological systems where those inputs or the different materials through the process cycle back through the process. And that's, I think, the last time I'll bring up any kind of photosynthesis discussion through the rest of the topic. I can't make any promises, but thank you for indulging me. So just to kind of reiterate the point, being circular, it's a good business opportunity and it's a responsibility. So we need to think about how we rethink our consumption habits, and just think about our responsibility towards this topic. And so, thinking about how this takes shape, literally and metaphorically. So in a linear economy, we're used to this, right? You take something, you make it, or you use it to make something, you dispose of whatever waste, and that goes into a landfill or a stream or whatever it is, and it just pollutes. And there's nothing that cycles back. What we're trying to do is make this circular, this model map this circular pattern. So the circular economy, it centers around the reuse of products and raw materials, and the prevention of waste and harmful emissions into the environment. So we're trying to close the loop. So what you're seeing here is an ideal closed loop system, and you'll notice the elimination of the dispose and pollute portions at the end of the linear chain. Realistically, that's not going to happen in most systems. You're not going to get a perfect closed loop, but the goal should be to minimize the outputs out of that circle as much as possible. And there's different ways to get there. So thinking of benefits of implementing some of this stuff, obvious one, cleaner environment, reducing hazardous waste or just waste in general. That seems pretty self-evident, right? The economic benefits and growth. This ties back to what I talked about before, which is we can maybe align to consumer preferences for more sustainable products and find ways to drive growth. It could be organic growth, it could be driving price. It can be economically better to implement these things. Scarcity of supply or security of supply. Again, rehashing what I talked about before, we can reduce scarcity of supply by adding new ways to reuse and recycle raw materials, for example. And then lastly, cost savings. This ties back to this idea of economic benefits and growth. There's this assumption that sustainability and reuse and recycle, it comes with a cost, and we really want to shift that framework and give examples and promote the idea that that's not necessarily true. It doesn't necessarily, implementing these types of solutions doesn't necessarily compromise costs, and in many cases it actually adds cost savings and can be business beneficial. But not everyone, it's not ingrained into people's thoughts necessarily. So driving that message home, making sure that the sustainable solution is considered and recognized as potentially cost beneficial, making that part of the culture of sustainability. That's really important, and we want to make sure that point is driven home. So as I go through this presentation, if there's one slide I want you to take away from this talk, it would be this one. This is a very tactical slide, a very in the weeds slide, but a very important one because it talks about kind of like I said before, where we need to think beyond just what's our raw material input into this. Like sustainability is a end-to-end process, and we have opportunities to address sustainable solutions at each stage in the process. And so, what I want to do as I go through this slide is just highlight, what each of these mean. What is that? 6 R's, you can think of it that way, or I guess 7, 8 if you include the rethink and reduce and repair and remanufacture. But each of these just manifest in different ways, all driving towards the same solution. So I'll go down this list and just talk about what each of these mean. So this idea of rethinking and reducing, and this is really the first stage of any process. We need to rethink the question of what is the customer's demand, and is the current model actually the right one to address that issue? So there's no point in going through and trying to create sustainability or address material inputs if we're not using the right material inputs to begin with, or if we're not actually addressing the customer's needs up front. It may seem obvious that, well, we're going to make something that whatever our product or service offering is, that's addressing customer needs, but is there an opportunity to re-engineer that, or work with the customer to drive towards a more sustainable solution and change the process up front? So before we get into anything in terms of materials or indirect parts, we know that we're addressing the actual correct issue. And then when we get to that point, in process design teams to design for sustainability up front, so we're not retrofitting an old process into a sustainable solution. Similar idea, so redesigning. This is kind of that next step. Once we've guaranteed that we've we are addressing the correct solution or addressing the correct customer problem. Taking the reuse, repair, the use of modular parts and different production processes into account. A good example of this, we had a customer come to us a couple of years ago, doesn't much matter, but they were looking for us to find cost savings. And it was a product that had a lot of small parts, a lot of widgets, not a lot of volume individually, not a lot of margin to take out. So, as we were looking for cost savings, we had to get creative. So what we ended up doing was looking at sub-assemblies and basically assembling portions of the larger part in overseas, and then shipping those sub-assemblies over and finalizing the assembly domestically. Now, our goal in doing that wasn't necessarily sustainability, but what ended up happening is it was cheaper for us to assemble this internationally, and we were shipping fewer things. So our footprint logistically was substantially lower. So if we had only looked at this from a material perspective and said, well, we've got a gear, we've got a single raw material that we need to find a way to negotiate it or bid it out, we wouldn't have made much progress and we would have spun our wheels quite a bit. But the fact that we went back and through this redesign stage and thought of ways to do sub-assemblies or figure out ways to work with the modular parts, we actually were able to take cost out and actually create some scale where we were able to address and find cost savings in more addressable areas. So sticking with this redesign phase, optimizing the production process. So I mentioned before that I come from the chemical industry, where a lot of production is done in big batch tanks. And what you try and do is you optimize your batch planning to reduce energy usage and reduce churn. So every time you're turning over batches, you're cleaning it out, you might be putting new products in. That's time and effort. That's energy used to clean it out. So really working on optimizing your production process, making sure batches or whatever that production process may look like is actually running on a schedule that makes sense. You're reducing the energy consumption. You're reducing churn internally for swapping things out, and that has logistical inputs down or benefits down the line as well, where you may be shipping out larger scales of individual products and filling up trucks, which reduces that logistical footprint as well. Sticking with this idea of redesigning, can we use renewable energy sources in the design of our processes? And can we just change our inputs so we're using less materials up front? What's our yield in the production process? And are we actually designing, again, this idea of designing towards sustainability? Can we change our inputs so that the materials are actually utilized in the highest yield capacity? So I'll keep going down this list, this idea of reuse. This I really think of in terms of total cost of ownership of assets. So this is a bit of a culture play internally, where we've all been in the situation. You have one part that is very cheap, it fits within the current budget, but it's going to break down in 6 months or a year. Or you've got the substantially more expensive one up front, but that it's going to last much longer. And which a lot of times if you have a culture that considers total cost of ownership, or a process that considers total cost of ownership, maybe you go towards that more expensive part. But how many times have we gone back to the cheaper option because it fit within the budget? So what we need to do is promote this idea and this culture of total cost of ownership, and make sure that there's organizational buy-in that's the way we're going to go, because in many cases that's going to be the cheaper option over the life cycle. There's additional inputs or externalities that we often don't consider. Time used to address a part that broke down, the effort from procurement to go source and keep an eye on the stock of the product of the part that is breaking down. All those little things that ideally that would be considered in the TCO model, but we don't always do. But then fitting back into this idea of sustainability, if something's going to break down all the time, be replacing it, suddenly you're cycling through the same product over and over, when you could be using a higher quality material and not have that swap out so frequently. So thinking of total cost of ownership, and the longer lifespan of products and production parts really fits into the sustainability model. And that feeds into this next one, repair and remanufacturing. Rather than throwing out a part, can we repair it? Can we remanufacture it so that it's getting reused and we're creating less waste? Very similar concept between reuse and repair and remanufacturing. And so it's not until we get all the way down to the second to last point that we even get to recycling, which I think is where a lot of people's minds go when they think about sustainability, is recycling models. It's not until here that we even consider it. So I really want, I mentioned this was an important slide. I really want everyone to come away recognizing there are so many more ways to address the idea of sustainability when you frame it in the terms of sustainability outside of recycling, although recycling is obviously a huge piece of this. So, in this case, can product be reworked, or waste streams? Again, going back to kind of the chemical example, are there waste streams that can be reused or sold as byproduct and get used in other production processes? So they're not just going into hazardous waste pickup and never to be seen again. And then lastly, this idea of recovery. This is mostly talking about energy consumption, heat capture being a good example. What can we recover from our production processes and put back into the system? And so from a procurement perspective or a supply chain perspective, we have to be stewards on the process and consider all the risks and possibilities at each stage of this process, considering our inputs and outputs, and most importantly, opportunities to address each of these stages through the supply chain life cycle. So even if we're necessarily the ones to re-engineer a process, can we be stewards of the culture of sustainability and try and drive engineering teams or product teams or whatever team it may be to consider some of these different ways of framing the problem, make sure that sustainability is a part of that discussion. So that was a long time on that single slide, but again, I think these are the most important points to make, and really frames the remaining discussion and examples that I'm going to talk about moving forward. So hopefully that was helpful. So this is a bit of a convoluted map, but the point here, and obviously, and not that I would expect anyone to try and memorize this, but you really don't need to. But the overarching point here is to point out that there are opportunities to create closed loop systems within each stage of the production life cycle or the supply chain life cycle. So you see at the top there, rethink and reduce. That's at the very early stage. Can we re-engineer certain products or redesign parts of our production process? But as you go down, is there opportunity to reuse product from the collection stage and bring that back to a service provider or to the production process and reuse it? Maintenance stays within the user stage, and that goes back to extending the life cycle of individual products. And even at the collection piece, you have an opportunity to either split off into a landfill and send things in the landfill, or is there opportunity to recover energy? So not going to go through every individual piece here, but the overarching theme, again, is just to say at each stage here, we can find ways to create closed loop systems. We just need to know what tools are available for us to actually create those systems. And that refers back to the previous slide where, redesigning, remanufacturing, repairing, those are all, tools in our toolkit to create those systems. We just have to map out our production process and understand where those inputs lie. So I've been pontificating about how great this is and how, everything about this is perfect. Obviously there's risks, right? And the biggest piece is the risk of increased interdependencies. So, everyone who's involved in a circular economy is interconnected and increasingly reliant on the preceding step or the preceding actor in that system. So, we have to take this into account and understand that there are both short and long-term consequences to be considered, and understand what that impact of those consequences could be to the end-to-end value chain. So the way to address that is really mapping out the system, understanding resource consumption, waste, identifying areas of risk and regulatory exposure, because this could, we talked about the resource scarcity piece, and this implementing these sustainable solutions can help your sole source situations, but if you're not careful, you can lock yourself into them as well. If you lock yourself into a single supplier who's incorporated into the circular economy, you're in effect, adding supplier by incorporating their recycled materials. And if you aren't accounting for their piece in the system, you may be locked in unintentionally because someone else can't provide that recycled material. So the important thing here is just visibility, making sure there's someone accountable for each stage in the life cycle, and understanding where those risks lie. So the best way to demonstrate this is to give you some real world examples. So I've got two here, one in more of a retail scenario, one in the chemical industry. And again, it's just me falling back on my own old patterns, but this is a concept that is really best exemplified through real world examples. So I want to show everyone here the way this has been utilized in real companies. So a good first one is this IKEA buyback program. And some of you may be familiar with this already, where this was October of 2020. IKEA announced that they were going to do a pilot program to buy back used furniture for resale and recycle. And so, what they were trying to do is shift the focus away from consumption to sustainability while driving growth. And IKEA, you all may know this, but they use an astronomical amount of wood, something like approximately 1% of the world's wood supply each year. And if you've seen lumber prices recently, that is notable. Let's put it that way. And so, what they're doing here is they're doing a couple things. One, they're implementing sustainable solutions and reducing waste, kind of like we talked about before. Either they're able to re-engineer some of the old furniture, reclaim it, put it into resale, or they're just putting into their own recycle programs or waste streams that are more sustainable options than someone just throwing it into a dumpster. But what they're also doing here, and this really drives back to this idea of driving organic customer retention for a couple of different reasons. One, better look for IKEA, right? They look like a more sustainable company. They care about their place in the world. They can market themselves in that way. But if you have an IKEA couch and you want to upgrade, well, if I'm going to get some money back, or if I can sell back my furniture to IKEA, I'll bring my old couch back, put it back in the store, and while I'm here, why don't I buy another couch? And you know what, I'll get some kitchen supplies while I'm here too. So you're encouraging customer retention, encouraging recycling and reselling, reducing your carbon footprint, and by the way, just from a marketing perspective, this is a positive win for IKEA as well. So it's a really good example of creating a sustainable model, how it fits into the environmental concerns while simultaneously helping to drive those positive business outcomes that we mentioned before. So the second one, and I'll preface this by saying this can be a bit of a convoluted example, so don't get lost in the weeds too much. But I mentioned before that so I come from the chemical industry. Chemical industry has the potential to be pretty dirty and have a big environmental impact. So I think this is a good example of showing, why a sustainable model or why a reclaim model is so important in a industry like this. And this example is really good because it covers a lot of bases. It addresses the use of dirty materials. So, IKEA, it's wood. If it gets thrown into the dump, well, at least it's organic matter and some of it's going to decompose well. That's not the case for, paint thinner, for example. So we're talking about dirty materials. This is an example where we found a more cost-effective way of utilizing recycled material. We're reducing waste and reducing the need for new product. And then it also demonstrates some more reverse logistics opportunities, which we haven't talked about too much, but optimizing pickup as part of this process. We don't always think of that as a sustainability effort, but reducing the number of trucks going back and forth, that has a huge impact and something that should be considered in the framework of sustainability. And so this was a process that I was very closely involved in. And what you can do here is think of paint thinner. Paint thinner is a really easy example where it's just a collection of a couple different solvents that you see at your Home Depots or your paint store, excuse me. And the way that's purchased or produced, it's a mix of solvents. but it's paint thinner. This doesn't need to be high grade stuff. It doesn't need to be the most pure stuff. So it can incorporate reclaimed and reused material. So what ends up happening is these bulk virgin solvents, they're purchased in bulk. They are blended down to incorporate reclaimed solvents that were originally picked up from a customer. So if you go from left to right, you've got a solvent blending site that's taking virgin solvent and reclaimed solvent, putting it together, sending it to a repackager who's then sending it to customers. Customers, they use the solvent, they send it into recycling houses, and then that gets picked up and sent right back to those reclaimed solvent blenders. And the big benefit here being that the solvent waste streams may be 20 to 40% less expensive than the virgin, but basically they just blend it to a spec that's acceptable for customer use. So what you're doing here is you're utilizing recycled material, and the recycled material doesn't have to exist on its own. It's getting blended in with the virgin solvent as well. So you can get it back to a spec that's acceptable for customer use, but you're cutting your reliance on the pure stuff while reducing your waste. And oh, by the way, you're improving your logistics strategies, because that loop from customer to the solvent blending site is a reverse logistic and a pickup optimization. So just to reiterate those points, by utilizing recycled solvent waste streams, we've found cost savings. We've decreased our reliance on the virgin solvent manufacturers. We've implemented reverse logistic practices to optimize pickups. And oh, by the way, most importantly, in theory, we've reduced harmful chemical waste. We're not putting solvents, someone's not pouring this down a drain to go into the water systems where it's creating a bunch of different issues. So it finds a way to take really nasty stuff and put it back into the system, back into that closed loop where it gets used again. And so everything I've talked to up until this point has been somewhat theoretical. It's been theory, it's been examples. So where I want to end this discussion is talking about something more tactical in terms of implementation, and how can we make this actually our companies and in our systems, and what it takes for us as procurement and supply chain professionals to be stewards of this process. And so the first one I want to highlight is this concept of organizational buy-in. And this is probably the most important one from this slide. Sustainability is rarely the easiest option, even if it's the most sensible one. And in some cases, it's not going to be the most sensible one. And so what needs to happen, we need top-down approval and top-down culture change that drives this concept of sustainability as something that's important. It has to be a strategic initiative to work on a larger scale, especially when cost isn't the driver. Procurement leaders, I think in many cases are trained to look at things somewhat black and white, whether their fault or not. Just sometimes we are evaluated by, what were we paying before? What are we paying now? What's our annual savings tied to that? And that's not always the best way to look at this, but from a cost and terms perspective. But we need to change that perspective and empower procurement and supply chain to drive towards strategic initiatives and evaluate them against those initiatives. So they need to be evaluated against, fair goals, and leadership should establish those priorities and, ensure accountability for circular economy initiatives. And organizations should engage business partners and customers to communicate the circular economy priorities. So that consistent management buy-in and making sure that everyone's being evaluated consistently against those goals is really, really important to making sure that this gets driven through an organization. And then, a change management process, implementing a robust change management process. I talked about the need to map out the end-to-end process to account for those interdependencies, but we really need to be careful about mapping out this whole process and understanding what the inputs and outputs are, and doing that in a really structured way. So this needs to comprehensively address and document all the opportunities and risks associated with each stage of the process. And so, we have to map out the current resource use, the waste generation, and hedge against the risks of implementing this, especially, for the potential of a more regulated and demanding, carbon reduction future, or if there are regulatory trends that push us more towards having to document each stage of the process. So I mentioned before from the organizational piece, we have to be able to measure this and evaluate our people on very clear goals. Similarly, KPIs and being clear on how we're measuring success is really important. And there are different ways of doing it. There are metrics that are tied to this, some that are more old and familiar. So reducing the amount of waste to landfills or CO2 emissions are kind of tried and true, but still valuable. But there are other new metrics or newer metrics that we can think about, the percent of reclaimed or reused materials in our production processes, or tracking the use of something like single-use plastic. How much are we using? Are we reducing the use of those single uses? And tracking those over time, creating some history and evaluating the way we're performing against those KPIs and the goals associated with them. Technology solutions. So, this kind of goes back to the re-engineering piece of the puzzle. Technology solutions, there are technologies that improve tracking and visibility of end-to-end supply chains. And that can help us with tracking the impact of each input. This is especially true, but when you talk about this next point, the reverse logistics strategies, there are softwares that specialize in logistics optimizations, reverse logistics pickups and optimization. And, so finding different technology solutions to support the initiatives in different ways can really, help make implementation easier, and making it easy is what, improves adoption. Again, to talk about this reverse logistics idea, reclaiming materials at the end of the life cycle, it requires reverse logistics for pickup and return, either to your organization or to a third party, and optimizing that delivery schedule and reducing waste from the material return and recycling process is really important in this process. So again, there's technology solutions available that can kind of do machine learning to help optimize routes away from landfills towards facilities where they can be processed for waste streams can be processed for rework and recycle. I'm not endorsing any one in particular, but there are technology and machine learning processes that just keep getting better and better, and those are ones that can be utilized to help drive a lot of these processes. And then last one, I don't know how much of the audience is more supply chain versus procurement. I come from a procurement background, so a lot of the tried and true procurement optimization efforts, usage optimization, product elimination. Can we, if we've got 1,000 SKUs, can we get that down to 750? Can we get it down to 100? And bundle more of our volume into a couple of key materials or key vendor relationships, because there's a lot of churn and a lot of wasted logistics, wasted effort if we are buying a bunch of products from a bunch of different sources that are getting us nowhere. And as procurement professionals, we know if we can bundle more and increase our scale, that puts us in a better negotiation position, and we can help drive cost out of the process. So similarly, spec optimization, spec standardization, that somewhat goes back to the re-engineering or redesign piece. Are we using the right materials? Are we, were new products introduced that weren't, when they were engineered or designed, maybe they were designed in a bit of a vacuum and weren't designed with our current procurement strategies or supply chain strategies in mind. Can we find ways to get them on board so they're not existing in this silo? And if we can optimize the spec or change the specs or the materials going into it, can it fit into our existing procurement strategies? And that helps reduce the redundancies or excess work associated with sourcing the materials going into those. So a lot of our just normal tried and true procurement strategies really feed into the sustainability efforts. We don't think of them as sustainability because they are just, it's purchasing. It's what we do on a day-to-day basis. But if we frame the problem as sustainability and we frame the outcomes as, streamlining a lot of these processes and understand the impact that it has on reducing our footprint, that adds increasing incentive to drive a lot of these forward. So, these are, 6 individual, implementation strategies. Again, I think organizational buy-in is what it all starts with. None of this happens if it's not a priority for your organization. That has to come top down to stay consistent, because these are difficult solutions and often it's not going to happen in a quarter, right, or a month. So, understanding and creating culture around sustainability. If I, had to pull out one piece of this to really hammer home, it would be that finding a way to make this a priority, make it part of the culture, and then let the project list or a lot of the implementation strategies trickle down from that establishment of that culture. And that's where I'll end it. So, I want to thank everyone for joining and listening in. I hope some of this resonated with you, and I'll kick it back to Kathy from there.
Thank you very much. That was a great presentation. Always love seeing that one. I did want to ask you though, if say you do have a linear supply chain, how do you go from one to the other? I know you need the organizational buy-in, but is there like guidelines?
It's a bit
on how you can actually start the process.
Yeah, so it's a bit situational. I'd point back to that slide, starting with sort of that redesign and re-engineering piece. Understanding who the stakeholders are in the process, getting them together and say, all right, we have a problem that we're trying to address, or we're trying to look for opportunities to create these closed loop systems. Procurement, we can't do that in a vacuum. We can maybe come up with some ideas, or procurement or supply chain. Again, I'm coming from a procurement perspective, but it has to be kind of a cross-organizational effort. So, creating sort of a sustainability initiative, or what would you call it? A team, there's a better name for it, but whose goal it is to find sustainability efforts. You'll see like chief sustainability officers in certain organizations where it's their goal to find opportunities like this. And it can be a bit of a needle in the haystack, but really finding someone to champion the effort and getting key stakeholders together to look for opportunities. That's really step one. But then past that, it does get a little situational. My mind kind of goes to some of those chemical examples, but in retail, you might come at it from a marketing perspective, kind of like IKEA did. So I hope that sort of addresses it, but I think the best thing is finding executive leadership and then creating sort of a team that with representation from key stakeholders in the process to help, identify opportunities and drive some of those efforts forward.
Yeah, because I do notice Apple actually does.
Mm-hmm.
They seem to be doing this particular model, and
Right.
It seems to be working very successful for them. It looks like they've been doing it for quite a while too, right?
Right.
Yeah, definitely. Okay. I don't see any questions in the chat. Oh, wait a minute. We do have a question. Okay. I know in the nonprofit space, there are grants available for this. How about in the for-profit sector?
That's a great question. Candidly, I have not gone through and tried to find any grant support. I would love to dig into that more. I wish I could give you more of an answer, but that's a great thing to bring up. I'm sure that there are opportunities to gain monetary support. My mind goes to tax breaks, honestly. It's not quite the same thing. But whether or not those opportunities exist in the for-profit world, I don't have direct experience with it. I would be curious to chase that down. So apologies if that's a bit of a non-answer, but it's a great point to bring up.
Oh, it is a great question. Definitely, Lonnie. Thank you for bringing that up to us. Might be something we might want to explore down the line too,
Yeah.
as well. Okay. I don't see any more questions, but I do really appreciate you coming to the chapter and presenting this particular topic, which of course I really enjoy, and I hope everybody else does. So I want to thank you for this informative presentation. And it is such a hot topic, and sustainability is so big out there right now, especially with different corporations. At this point, I would like to let everybody know we are recording this particular program. So if you'd like to share it with anybody, it will be on our YouTube channel later today. Please note that our last event of the program year will be next week. So please be sure to register. And that particular topic is going to be on enhanced supply chain skills for every work environment. So at this point, I'm going to close the program out. Thank all of our members for joining. Thank you, Ian, for presenting today. And I hope everybody has a great day.
Thanks, everyone.